Hello. It is week 6 in the tabletop role playing class, and we are playing Dialect. So, I'm going to recap what happened in class for those students who were not there, explain a little bit about what's going to happen for those students who were unable to join us today, and then I will get into the kind of higher order how I did not foresee particular things because this is the first time that I'm teaching and running dialect in the classroom. So, whenever a plan meets students, it kind of is always going to kind of warp in some way, shape, or form. So, the setup for dialect, which is a game about language and how it dies, is was originally intended since I have 13 students for 3 tables of 3 and 1 table of 4. We now have, because of absences, 1 table of 3 and 2 tables of 4. The students who were unable to attend today will be observers with possible ability to be included in tables. We'll see. Much depends. So that's kind of the nature of the beast when we're talking about playing games in class over multiple days. If you're not there on the first day, we can't set up for you. So sometimes we can accommodate by kind of including in later rounds, which I think dialect does support. But a lot of the initial world building in terms of characters is lost. So, the way that we arrange it in order to make it a meaningful experience and to encourage students to come when they can is that students can sit at the table and observe the flow of play when they're there. So, that's the PSA for today. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Dialect is intended for 2 to 5 players, and the amount of runtime kind of expands with the number of students. And because we couldn't have tables of 3 across the board, that meant that we had one table that was by its very nature running faster than the other 2. So we ended today with the entire classroom at the cusp of transitioning from the first age to the second. And that's about half-ish way through play, depending. The the tricky part about dialect is that you spend a lot of time kind of setting up the world, setting up the selecting the scenario, what's called in the game system the isolation. In other words, the reason why the players are creating new language separate from a kind of dominant group. A dominant group that in some way, shape, or form is going to come back and make the isolation irrelevant, hence the how language dies. So you're doing a lot of prep before you even start making words and doing role play. First, selecting the scenario, and there are 4 base scenarios and then an additional 12 that are, made by various kind of creators from Ajit George, to, Alex Roberts and, Maggie Baker and beyond. So, 2 tables are playing one of the standard, initial starting thieves can't, isolations, and the other got really excited about, one of the, supplemental, the DACA expansion. So they didn't get to sit down right away, but had to kind of negotiate. And some students were far more interested in ensuring who they were playing with. Others were more excited about a particular concept. But once we were settled, which was about 5 ish minutes into class, because students arrive pretty early to this class, we then proceeded into the actual development of the different phases of the scenario. So that includes some tricky concepts because one of the things that's difficult about dialect is its particular choice of language to describe different things. For example, I keep calling it scenarios because for me, that's a more illustrative word of what you're selecting than the word that dialect chooses, which is isolation. In the same way, the group is asked to think about the aspects of the isolation. And that can be tricky for folks to kind of get their heads around, even though they've read the rules and I read the salient parts of the rules out again as the kind of facilitator for all of the different tables. And so I think that took longer than it probably needed to, uh, precisely because I think that was a point of friction. The other tricky part is that I had created duplicate aspect cards separate from the different age cards, and that's unnecessary. Basically, the aspects are what's changing from age to age. And so here we are, but it's fine. I played with a single deck, and on my Instagram, I walk through how I broke down the deck. What's really nice about Dialect is you really only need one physical copy of the game as long as you have fewer than 14 players. Basically, the only thing that I had to print and play was an extra set of legacy cards for two additional tables. There simply isn't enough legacy cards in the deck to distribute across more than one table. However, the kind of all of the other cards, there are at least enough to give students one option. And in many cases, like the age one and two cards, they have more than one option. And what's actually really helpful about the constraint of fewer cards and fewer decisions is at least that part becomes shorter. You either accept the card you're dealt, or in the case of our class, there were a few extras on the main table. So if a student really didn't want to be the leader, they could go over to the main table and look at the role cards that hadn't been dealt out to folks. And so that helped speed up that part, although character creation itself, picking names, figuring out your relationship to the aspects, and doing the introductions still took a fair amount of time. So by the time all of the setup for the game had happened, we really didn't have a huge amount of time left for actual gameplay. So part of me thinks that in a future iteration of this class, I will literally just budget 3 days from the start. The first day being a going over of the rules, setting up the scenarios, letting people take the time they need to, and going over the rules of turn-based play one more time with the idea that actual creation of words and role play, the literal turns of dialect, we would do the first two ages on day two, maybe the third age, and then the legacy, um, and kind of feedback on the third day. As it is, what's actually going to happen is on Thursday, luckily, the groups that also were kind of still wrapping up their first age also arrive early to class. So we will be able to get them all basically in shape and ready to make the transition to the second age, which is the last thing that I'm going to walk them through until the legacy stage of the game. They'll all be ready when we start class. I'm expecting that we will get through at minimum the second and third age in the span of class on Thursday. If we get through to the end, which is the legacy portion of the game, that'd be awesome. I'll still leave Tuesday of next week for processing as well as the buffer. We originally had some assigned reading to go over, and I'll bump that to our Thursday meeting connected to Big Bad Con, and that'll be just fine. And this is the important kind of takeaway that I've always had from kind of teaching games is whatever you think a game's runtime is, you're either keeping people to a very strict timer or you're adding just give yourself one more class day than you think you're going to need, if you know it's a multiple day game. I've encountered this with Alice is Missing, and Alice is Missing has a timer attached to that game, right? It's exactly a very controlled clock, but the key is that preparation phase can take different amounts of time. I did use timers to guide students. The trick is, of course, is that one group is always going to be faster because there are fewer students, and so there's just fewer kind of elements of play. And the 4Bs just are going to take longer because there's four of them. So it's a kind of careful calibration to kind of keep everybody on track, but worth it. The table of 3 basically had more time to kind of look over stuff ahead of time or kind of refine what they were doing, um, and, I think it's working out just fine. I feel comfortable, and of course, this is a useful all of this is, grist for the mill of learning, thinking about these kinds of differences. The difference in the number of people at the table is a kind of built-in friction or transformation of the game. And so we'll talk about when we ultimately finish the game and reflect about the difference. Like, what did the 4B tables think about? Did they feel like they were being rushed all the time? Did they feel like having four players was a more rich experience? Did the 3Bs feel like they didn't have enough? Were they enriching in other kinds of ways? I don't have a good answer to any of that, but we're going to figure it out. And I repeatedly, as part of this process, encouraged students to think about this in terms of the realm of experiment. They know that every other game that we're playing in class I have run before and I know what I'm doing. And I was very candid with them that this was the new and experimental game. And there's enough buy in and excitement because we have a linguist in the room, in the class, and other kinds of things where I think that it works out. It works out well. The stories that they're telling are definitely engaging and nobody is off topic. Even when like a group finishes, they're still talking about the world of their game as they wait for the next phase, which is very exciting. And you can see how this is often used as one of those world building exercises, even though it is like The Quiet Year, a game that comes to a resolution. It comes to a conclusion that means that the isolation is over, for good, for ill, and everything in between. So, dialect is taught by a lot of folks for a lot of different reasons, and it has won innumerable awards, and it's absolutely, I think, worth it. I had considered instead using Sign, which is by the same publisher, a game that's played entirely silently, but does require that one student in the group is a teacher and the others are playing the roles of kind of students. And so I basically decided, as I generally do for as many of the games that I'm playing in class as possible, to select GM-less games that may have a facilitator, but a facilitator that's not always hands-on, that I can take a fair amount of that role. And this is also true, for example, with Alice is Missing. The Charlie is doing some of the kind of initial startup, but in terms of kind of knowing the rules and keeping everybody on track, that's my job. I'm moving between tables, checking in on folks, all of those sorts of things. My kingdom for a dialect timer, but really the tricky part is that it's hard to know how much time people are going to need to do different elements of the task. Um, I My best estimate is for a table of 4, for example, doing 1 age of the game is about 25 minutes. It can probably expand to fill more time if you give it, but it can be brought in under the wire in 25 minutes. And so that's something that I'm keeping in mind. I have a 75-minute class, but it takes a few minutes. Some students are late. We also need, if we're in the middle of a game, to kind of break down and get everything ready so that I can take it with me and it's all coherently organized so that I can put it back out on the tables. And that took a couple of minutes per table of putting all the things in a particular player's hands, folding it inside of their player kind of name card, stacking those, clipping them together, uh, and then clipping the cards that haven't yet been used, clipping those together, as well as the kind of handouts and other things. But it worked really nicely and very cleanly. It's very compact to move around. And even if we had a whole bunch of physical copies, I really, really wish this game had the ability to buy additional decks. That would be really, really handy for organizing play. But we don't necessarily need it, and we don't necessarily need the expense. We did have students referring to the PDF on their phone. They have access through a locked down system to that rule set, but I had also printed out the turn of play, as well as the kind of initial setup guidelines. So while I was reading the full version from the book out loud, they had the shorter version and the kind of visuals from that were involved. So yeah, so far it's not going quite according to plan. Originally, I intended that dialect would just be this week, and I suspect we'll go over if only to discuss our experience more closely. But I think it segues very nicely into what we will be talking about for next week, which is kind of questions of representation and embodiment and perspective in those kinds of ways, which will continue to be a theme for us for the next, you know, well, forever, right? This class notoriously fulfills a diversity requirement for many of the students. And so it's important that we are all, kind of talking about representation in all kinds of ways. We will transition after I return from Big Bad Con to our final collective play experience, Alice is Missing, which is also a kind of 3 days kind of experience. So, set up on day 1, play on, for most of day 2, and then, kind of complete the experience on the 3rd day and do the kind of decompression, thinking through kind of phase. And then Gabe comes, which is very exciting. Gabe Hicks will be joining us, to talk. So that's the lay of the land, and that's how dialect is going so far. We'll see how everything resolves as students continue to explore the worlds they're making through language. A really great class, a really great game for English classes in particular, I think. So, all of that said, it's a heck of a week already. It's only Tuesday. Exciting things to talk about on Thursday when the embargo lifts from upcoming news from Dimension 20, etc. So that may also be part of our office hour next time. But until then, have a really great day and bye.